What happens when a respected surgeon is thrown behind bars for a crime he didn't commit? The judge who sentenced him had no idea whose life he had just destroyed, but when the truth came out, it wasn't the surgeon's future that crumbled, it was his own. The day began like any other. Dr. Marcus Hale, one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in Chicago, stepped out of his office, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine white coat. 10 years in the field had made him a name to remember. His hands had pulled people back from the brink, stitched lives together, given families the miracles they prayed for. But to him, it wasn't about fame or prestige. It was about the work, the precision, the fight against time and chance. His schedule was stacked: rounds, consultations, a long overdue conference call with an insurance company that seemed to believe surgeons worked for free. But one case today stood out above the rest: a 9-year-old boy born with a rare and severe heart defect, a condition that most surgeons wouldn't touch. A surgery that, if it failed, meant devastating loss for a family already on their knees. Marcus had seen the mother. The desperation in her eyes, the way she gripped her son's hand as if she could hold him to this world by sheer force of will. He had seen the father, silent, stone-faced, like a man who had already prepared for the worst but couldn't bear to say it out loud. He had seen the child, small, fragile, yet strangely calm, as if he understood something the adults in the room didn't, as if he had already made peace with the cards he had been dealt. That was the thing about kids. They didn't fake it. They didn't know how, and they sure as hell didn't deserve to be on an operating table instead of a playground. Marcus scrubbed in, the scent of antiseptic filling his nose as he methodically cleaned his hands. The routine was second nature by now. Soap, rinse, scrub, rinse again. Then the gloves, the mask, the armor of a man about to step into battle. He entered the OR, the chill in the air cutting through his skin. The overhead lights glared down, bouncing off polished steel and sterile drapes. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, setting up instruments, checking monitors. The anesthesiologist stood by, already watching the boy's vitals like a hawk. "Vitals are steady," a nurse reported. Marcus nodded, stepping up to the table. The child lay still, his small chest rising and falling beneath the oxygen mask. It never got easier, working on someone so young. But hesitation had no place here. A single deep breath, a glance at his team, and then scalpel. The first incision was always the hardest. The moment the blade met skin, the room fell into silence. The kind of silence that wasn't really silent at all, just the steady beeping of monitors, the quiet murmur of suction, the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Every move was calculated, every stitch was precise. One wrong slip, one miscalculation, and everything could go sideways in an instant. The defect was worse than expected. The heart, fragile as glass, needed more than just correction. It needed a miracle. Time blurred. 1 hour, 2. Sweat beaded on Marcus's forehead, but his hands never wavered. And then a heartbeat, steady, strong, a rhythm that meant life. The tension in the room shattered all at once. A nurse let out a quiet breath. The anesthesiologist checked the monitor, then gave a sharp nod. Relief, thick and tangible, flooded the air. Marcus pulled back, his pulse still racing, but his work was done. The boy would live. He peeled off his gloves, then his mask, exhaling slowly. His eyes drifted to the child's face, peaceful, unaware of how close he had come to the edge. It never stopped being humbling. The power to hold life in your hands, the responsibility of it. "Excellent work, Doctor," his assistant said. Marcus nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He didn't do this for praise. He did it because it was what he was meant to do. Because if he didn't, who would? Another life saved, another family spared unbearable loss. He stepped out of the OR, rolling the tension from his shoulders. The rest of the night stretched before him. Paperwork, maybe some sleep if he was lucky. What he didn't know was that in just a few hours, none of that would matter. that the same hands that had just saved a child's life would soon be in cuffs, that by the time the sun rose again, his name wouldn't be spoken with gratitude. It would be dragged through the mud. Because in a world like this, being a good man didn't always save you. This story is just getting started, but trust me, what happens next? You won't want to miss it. The gas station lights buzzed overhead, casting a flickering glow on the pavement. The air was thick with the usual late-night mix, burnt coffee, gasoline, and the faint scent of cheap air fresheners from the cars rolling in and out. Marcus stepped out of his vehicle, stretching his shoulders after a long shift. His hoodie hung loose over his frame, his jeans slightly wrinkled from hours in the OR. A simple red cap sat snugly on his head, shielding his face from the glare of the fluorescent lights. Nothing about him screamed trouble. He just wanted a bottle of water, that's all. He walked into the convenience store, grabbed what he needed, nodded to the tired-looking cashier, and stepped back outside, unscrewing the cap as he made his way to his car. That's when he saw them. 2 officers walking straight toward him with the kind of energy that meant trouble. He knew that walk, knew it too well. They weren't here for a friendly chat. "Sir, can we see some ID?" The first cop's voice was firm, but his grip on the flashlight was even firmer, the beam landing square on Marcus's face. Marcus frowned. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't parked illegally. He wasn't blasting music or loitering or doing anything that even remotely warranted police attention. Still, here they were. "What's the problem?" he asked, keeping his tone calm even. "You match a description." "Oh, of course." Marcus let out a slow breath, already knowing how this was going to go. And what description would that be? He tilted his head slightly, meeting their eyes with that same practiced patience he'd had to perfect over the years. The second cop smirked. Black male, medium build, dark clothing. That was it? That was the whole description? Might as well have said, man existing while black at night. Marcus exhaled through his nose. These weren't the kind of guys who wanted a conversation. They wanted compliance. Fine. "Dr. Hale," he said, pulling his wallet out carefully, making sure every movement was slow and obvious. "Here's my ID." The first cop took it, barely glancing at the name before passing it back. But there was something in their eyes. Something shifty, uncertain. Like they weren't expecting him to be anyone important. Like they'd already decided how this was going to go. Then came the shift. "Hands on your head," the second cop ordered, voice sharp. Marcus blinked. "Excuse me?" "Do it. Now." He didn't move, not yet. "I just gave you my ID," he said, voice steady. "Is there a reason you're detaining me?" That was when the first officer grabbed him. It wasn't gentle. The sudden force spun Marcus slightly, and before he could react, his chest was pressed against the cool metal of his car. A rough hand yanked his arms behind his back, twisting them at an angle that made his shoulders strain. Then came the cold bite of metal around his wrists. Click, click. "What's going on?" Marcus demanded, twisting slightly to look over his shoulder. The cop didn't bother answering, just patted him down with the kind of aggression that suggested he was looking for an excuse, not a weapon. Then, finally, the words came. "You're under arrest." Marcus's stomach dropped. For what? Armed robbery and assault. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he stared at them, the absurdity of the moment settling over him like a thick, suffocating fog. "You've got the wrong guy." Neither of them cared. He could see it in their eyes. This wasn't about truth. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. And tonight, they'd already decided whose life they were going to turn upside down. "We're at the tipping point now. What happens next? You won't want to miss it." The cell was cold, not just in temperature, but in the way it seeped into your bones, made you feel like you didn't belong to yourself anymore. The walls were lined with scratches, marks left by men who had been here before him, each tally a silent testimony to how long they had waited for someone to listen. Marcus sat on the metal bench, back against the wall, staring at the flickering light above him. He wasn't the first man to sit in this cell, and he wouldn't be the last. The hours stretched. No phone call, no explanation, just a long night of silence, broken only by the occasional bark of a guard and the low murmurs of other detainees. He had saved a life just hours ago, and now he was nothing more than a case number in a system that didn't care. Morning came too soon. A guard appeared at the bars, keys jingling in one hand, a clipboard in the other. "Hale, let's go." Marcus pushed himself up, his muscles stiff from a night on the unforgiving bench. The walk down the corridor felt surreal, each step echoing louder than it should have. The hall smelled of disinfectant, old sweat, and something else, something heavier. They led him into the courtroom. It was the kind of room designed to make you feel small. The judge's bench loomed high, the wooden panels dark and imposing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the rows of people waiting for their turn to be judged. Marcus took his seat at the defendant's table. His attorney hadn't arrived yet. That didn't surprise him. A heavy door creaked open, and then he saw him. The judge, tall, stern, cold eyes that had long since stopped seeing people and only saw cases, numbers, outcomes. Marcus straightened his back. Whatever was about to happen, he wouldn't face it with his head down. The clerk stepped forward, clearing his throat. Case number 36782, the State versus Marcus Hale. Charges, assault and robbery. Marcus kept his face unreadable, but inside a storm was brewing. Robbery? Assault? He had spent last night cutting open a child's chest to save his life, and now they wanted to put him away like some street criminal? The judge leaned forward slightly, scanning the paperwork in front of him. Then his eyes lifted to Marcus. "State your name." His voice was flat. Marcus lifted his chin. "Dr. Marcus Hale." A slow, deliberate pause. Then the judge let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Another doctor claiming he's innocent." The way he said it, like the title meant nothing, like Marcus had pulled it out of thin air. A simmering heat coiled in Marcus's chest. "Your Honor," he said, voice even, "I have evidence. I was at the hospital performing surgery when this so-called crime occurred. Security footage? Hospital records?" The judge raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "We'll see," he said, voice dismissive, "but I've seen plenty of cases like yours before." And there it was, the unspoken truth. This wasn't about facts. It wasn't about justice. This man had already made up his mind, and Marcus was about to find out just how deep the system was willing to bury him. The air in the courtroom had a weight to it, heavy, charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Marcus sat stiffly, hands folded in his lap, watching as the prosecutor strutted toward the witness stand. The man had the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome, like this whole trial was just a formality. "Your Honor, the state calls Mrs. Helen Booker to the stand." The doors creaked open, and in walked an elderly woman, small-framed, neatly dressed, with the kind of composure that suggested she truly believed in what she was about to say. She settled into the witness chair, placing both hands in her lap. The bailiff swore her in, and the prosecutor wasted no time. "Mrs. Booker," he began smoothly, "do you see the man who robbed you?" Her gaze flickered across the room before landing squarely on Marcus. "That's him." Her voice was firm, unshaken. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marcus barely blinked. He had never seen this woman in his life. Not once. His attorney, a woman named Karen Lee, leaned forward. "Mrs. Booker, are you absolutely sure?" The old woman gave a tight nod. "I'll never forget his face." That was when Marcus finally spoke. "Ma'am," his voice was steady, controlled, "are you sure you're not mistaking me for someone else?" Her lips pursed. "I know what I saw." The prosecutor turned back toward the judge, his expression smug, as if this was the nail in the coffin. Karen, however, wasn't done. "Mrs. Booker," she said, flipping through her notes, "where exactly did this robbery take place?" The woman's face hardened. "Right outside Miller's Market." Karen nodded, then glanced toward Marcus. "Interesting." She stepped forward, holding up a stack of papers. "Because we have surveillance footage showing that Dr. Hale was at Chicago General Hospital at the exact time of this alleged incident. He was in an operating room, Performing surgery? The courtroom went silent. Marcus could feel the shift, the way a few people stiffened, the way some exchanged glances. For the first time, the witness hesitated. "Well," she muttered, shifting slightly. "It was dark. Maybe I—" The prosecutor cleared his throat, cutting her off. "Your Honor, we'll need to review this supposed footage before considering it as evidence." Karen raised an eyebrow. "The footage is time-stamped, and it clearly shows—" The judge lifted a hand. "We'll examine it later." Karen opened her mouth, ready to protest, but Marcus already knew it wouldn't matter. The judge had already decided how this was going to go. "Motion for bail, Your Honor," Karen said, squaring her shoulders. "Dr. Hale is a respected surgeon with no criminal record. There is no reason to hold him without bail." The judge barely hesitated. Denied. A final gavel strike. Just like that, it was over. A guard stepped forward, gripping Marcus's arm. His chest tightened, but he kept his face calm. Because he had seen this before. In this system, the truth wasn't always enough. And right now, he was learning that firsthand. The sound of the heavy metal door slamming shut behind Marcus echoed in his bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a statement. A reminder that, for now, he wasn't a surgeon. He wasn't a man with a name, a career, a family. He was just another case number in a system that didn't care who he was or what he had done. The cell was small, barely enough space to stretch out. The walls were thick with the stories of men who had sat in this same place, their frustration and hopelessness scratched into the concrete like an unspoken history. The air was thick with stale sweat, disinfectant, and something else, a quiet kind of despair that settled in the bones of the forgotten. As Marcus took a slow step forward, a voice cut through the silence. "Man, they got you too, huh?" Marcus turned, his eyes settling on a man lounging on the bottom bunk like he had been born there. He was young, probably late 20s, built lean, with a sharp face, and the kind of eyes that had seen too much too soon. He had that half-smirk, half-sigh expression of someone who already knew how this story ended. Marcus didn't answer right away. He just exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face before sitting on the opposite bunk, his body still stiff from the tension of the last 24 hours. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I know that look. That what the hell just happened look. Seen it 1,000 times." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Welcome to the system." Marcus let out a slow breath. "Yeah, well, I don't plan on staying long." The man let out a low, humorless laugh. "Yeah, neither did I." Marcus glanced at him. "How long you been here?" The man stretched his arms behind his head, looking up at the ceiling like he had all the time in the world. 6 months. Marcus frowned. "Convicted?" "Nah," the man scoffed. "They just hit me with charges. Said I fit the description." Now I'm sitting here, waiting. Marcus felt his stomach twist. 6 months? His voice was steady, but inside, anger simmered. Waiting for what? Tony gave him a dry look. Trial, man. That thing they pretend is about justice, but is really about how much money you got. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had known the system was broken, but sitting here, listening to it from a man who had been caught in its gears, it hit different. You got a lawyer? Tony snorted, shaking his head. Man, what lawyer? You think they hand out good ones for free? They assigned me some dude who shows up twice a month, barely remembers my name, and keeps telling me to take the deal. Marcus's hands curled into fists. What deal? Tony's smirk faded, replaced by something colder. They want me to plead guilty. Take 3 years instead of risking 10. Marcus exhaled sharply. And you didn't do it. Course not, but that don't matter. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Marcus understood what was happening here. The system wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about pressure. Wear a man down long enough, dangle a way out in front of him, and eventually he'll take it, whether he's guilty or not. You got a name? Marcus finally asked. The man nodded. Tony. Marcus. Tony's smirk returned, just a flicker of it. Yeah? They hit you with something serious? "Assault and robbery," Marcus said flatly. Tony let out a long whistle. "Let me guess. You weren't even there?" "Bingo." Tony shook his head, leaning back against the wall. "Yeah, sounds about right. What, some random lady picked you out of a lineup?" "Something like that." "Figures." Silence again. Marcus ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. He had spent the last 10 years saving lives, training for years to become a man people trusted when they were at their most vulnerable. And now, he was sitting in a concrete box, treated like a criminal, because someone had pointed a finger and a judge had decided that was enough. He wasn't naive. He knew how these stories usually ended, but he wasn't planning on letting this system swallow him whole. He glanced back at Tony. "You giving up?" Tony exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Nah, but I ain't got a plan either." Marcus sat up a little straighter. "Well, I do." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? What's that?" Marcus looked toward the barred window, the faint glow of the outside world barely visible beyond the thick walls. "Get out of here, and not in 3 years. Now!" If the system wanted to break him, it was going to have to try a hell of a lot harder than this. The next time Marcus walked into the courtroom, he felt different. Less like a surgeon fighting for his life, and more like a man walking into a rigged game where everyone already knew the final score. He had spent the last few nights in a cell that smelled like regret and lost time, listening to the murmurs of men who had been through this before. Some were still fighting. Some had already given up. Marcus wasn't the giving up type. So when Karen Lee, his attorney, walked through the doors with a determined look on her face, he sat up straighter. "Marcus," she said, sliding into the chair beside him, "we found a witness, someone who can confirm you were at the hospital during the time of the alleged crime." For the first time since this nightmare began, something in his chest loosened. "Who?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "A nurse," Karen said. "She was on shift that night, saw you go into the operating room, saw you come out, and we have time-stamped hospital records to back it up." Marcus exhaled slowly. Finally. Proof. Real, undeniable proof that he wasn't anywhere near that so-called crime scene. He turned toward Karen, his lips pressing into a firm line. "That's it then. Case closed." Karen didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced toward the judge's bench, her expression shifting just slightly. Marcus followed her gaze. Judge Johnson sat there, flipping through paperwork like he had somewhere better to be. His face was unreadable, but Marcus could feel it. Something wasn't right. Still, he shook off the feeling. "We present the witness, and I go home," he said, as if saying it out loud would make it true. Karen hesitated, then slowly she nodded. "That's how it should work." The words hung between them. Should. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge adjusted his glasses, barely glancing up before waving his hand. "Let's proceed." Karen stood, smoothing out her blazer. "Your Honor, the defense has located a witness who can confirm my client's alibi." She stepped forward, placing a file on the desk. "Additionally, we have hospital records that prove he was performing surgery at the exact time of the alleged incident." Marcus sat up, waiting for the shift. The moment where logic would take over and this whole mess would be over. Instead, the judge barely looked at the file. He let out a slow breath, leaned back in his chair, and shrugged. "This doesn't change anything." Silence. Marcus blinked. "Excuse me?" Karen's lips parted slightly, like she too was waiting for some kind of explanation that never came. The judge waved a hand dismissively. "This so-called alibi is irrelevant to the case at hand." Marcus felt a slow heat crawl up his neck. "How is it irrelevant?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. "It proves I wasn't there." The judge barely spared him a glance. "We'll review it later." Later. Marcus clenched his fists under the table. He had heard that word before. It was what people said when they had no intention of ever getting around to something. Karen straightened her spine. "Your Honor, with all due respect, if we have definitive proof that my client was nowhere near the crime scene, then..." The judge exhaled through his nose, cutting her off with a slight shake of his head. "I've seen plenty of cases like this," he said, his tone heavy with something Marcus didn't like. "Evidence isn't always what it seems." Marcus's pulse ticked up. He had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. This wasn't about facts. It wasn't about justice. This was a script, and the judge had no intention of letting him rewrite the ending. Karen opened her mouth to argue again, but the judge was already turning to the clerk. "The defendant's bail remains denied," he said simply, his gavel slamming down with a finality that sent a cold shock through Marcus's spine. The bailiff moved toward him before the words had even fully settled in the air. Hands gripped his arm, pulling him to his feet. He barely registered it. His mind was still stuck on the absurdity of it all. He had proof, hard proof. And yet, it didn't matter. Because this wasn't a trial. It was a performance. And no matter what he said, what evidence he had, the system had already written his part. The news hit the airwaves like a wildfire. At first, it was just a small segment buried between weather updates and a report about a lost dog in the suburbs. But then it spread. Because a black man in Chicago, a respected surgeon, thrown in jail over a crime he didn't commit. That wasn't just a news story. That was a scandal. And Lauren Hale made sure the world heard it. She didn't come to the press conference to cry. She didn't come to beg. She came to fight. Standing outside the courthouse, microphones shoved in her face, cameras flashing, she took a deep breath and spoke. "My husband," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering, "is a doctor, a surgeon who has saved countless lives in this city. He was in an operating room the night of this so-called crime. There is video footage. There are hospital records. And yet, somehow, he is sitting in a jail cell right now. Tell me, how does that make sense?" The reporters leaned in. Phones recorded. Twitter was already catching fire. Lauren's dark eyes scanned the crowd, daring someone to answer her question. But no one could. Instead, one of the reporters, a woman from Channel 7, lifted her mic. "Mrs. Hale, do you believe your husband is being targeted unfairly?" Lauren didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, jaw clenched. "This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. This is a broken system trying to make an innocent man disappear." A murmur rippled through the press. Cameras zoomed in. Lauren wasn't just here to defend her husband. She was putting the entire system on trial. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she continued, "and if we don't fight back, it won't be the last." The words landed like a hammer, and suddenly this wasn't just Marcus Hale's fight anymore. This was bigger. Lauren turned her gaze to the cameras, her voice steady, strong. "My husband deserves justice, and we won't stop until he gets it." The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. "Surgeon wrongfully jailed. Wife demands justice." "Falsely accused. Highly respected doctor fights for freedom." Did the system fail Marcus Hale? The court didn't like attention. The judge? He hated it. By the time reporters started digging into his history, his rulings, his connections, Judge Johnson had to say something. So, later that evening, as pressure mounted, he stepped in front of a podium, cameras rolling, and did what men like him always did. He dismissed it. "These rumors," he said, voice smooth and rehearsed, "are just that, rumors. The court does not operate based on speculation or media influence." His hands rested on the podium, firm and controlled. "The public should not rush to judgment before the legal process is complete." Translation: don't believe what you see, believe what we tell you. But people weren't buying it, because justice wasn't supposed to need a PR campaign. And now, the world was watching. Marcus sat across from his lawyer in a cold, windowless room, the kind designed to make you feel small. The fluorescent light above hummed faintly, casting a dull glow over the scratched-up metal table between them. Karen Lee, his attorney, had a folder in front of her, but she hadn't opened it yet. Instead, she just looked at him, studying him, like she was trying to decide how to deliver the news. He already knew it wasn't good. "All right, Marcus," she said finally, folding her hands together. "The prosecution made an offer." The way she said it, carefully, deliberately, told him everything he needed to know before she even got to the details. 3 years, she continued, watching his reaction. Plead guilty, serve your time, and you walk out with a record, but at least you walk out. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, he slowly leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. I'm innocent, he said, his voice steady. Karen sighed. I know that, but they don't care. His jaw tightened. 3 years. 3 years locked away for a crime he did not commit. 3 years stripped of his career, his name, his freedom. For what? To make their job easier, to close the case fast. Marcus, Karen said carefully, I need you to really think about this. I've seen men fight these cases and lose. If this goes to trial and they get a conviction, you could be looking at 10 to 15 years. Marcus exhaled through his nose, but the fire in his chest only burned hotter. So that was the game. They weren't offering him a deal. They were threatening him. Take the 3 or risk losing everything. A trap disguised as mercy. His fingers curled into fists on the table. I am not confessing to something I didn't do. Karen didn't look surprised, but she did look tired. Marcus, listen. No, he cut in, his voice sharp. I was in an operating room that night. I have witnesses, I have hospital records, and none of that mattered because a judge who already made up his mind said it didn't. So why the hell would I roll over and give them exactly what they want? Karen pressed her lips together, silent for a beat. Then she opened the folder in front of her, flipping through a few pages before turning it toward him. Because they're stacking the deck, she said. This is the witness testimony the prosecution just submitted. Marcus's eyes flicked to the page. His stomach dropped. The woman. The one who pointed him out in court. The one who hesitated when Karen mentioned his alibi. Her statement had changed. Now she was absolutely certain it was him. His pulse pounded. How? He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. She wasn't sure before. She is now. Marcus gritted his teeth. So this was how it worked. They didn't need real evidence. They just needed enough noise to make it look like evidence. Karen tapped the folder. This is what you're up against. Marcus looked her straight in the eye. And I'm telling you, I don't care. Karen exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. You're making this harder on yourself. No, Marcus said, shaking his head. They are. Karen studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she sighed. All right, she said, closing the folder. Then we fight. Marcus nodded once, firm. Because if the system wanted to break him, it was going to have to try a lot harder than this. The courtroom was silent. That thick, suffocating kind of silence that pressed against the walls, creeping into every corner. The kind that came before the fall. Marcus sat at the defense table, his spine straight, shoulders squared, face unreadable. He had spent years perfecting that expression in the OR, when every second counted and panic was a luxury no one could afford. But this wasn't a life or death surgery. This was his own life on the table. And the people holding the scalpel? They weren't here to save him. Karen stood beside him, calm but sharp, like a blade just waiting to cut through the nonsense. Your Honor, she said, voice clear and controlled, as I have already presented, the hospital's security footage confirms that my client was in an operating room at the exact time of the alleged crime. These records, she lifted the documents for emphasis, are time-stamped and verified by multiple medical professionals. She turned toward the jury, locking eyes with them, daring them to ignore the truth. Dr. Marcus Hale was doing what he does best, saving a child's life, not committing a robbery. She let the weight of those words settle before taking a step back. This case should never have even made it this far. Marcus held his breath. This was it. The truth had been laid out. The evidence was airtight. There was no way, absolutely no way, this could go wrong. Then the judge leaned forward, and he smirked. Marcus's stomach dropped. That was all it took. That one smirk. That one flicker of something in the judge's eyes that told him this had never been a real trial to begin with. The judge turned his gaze toward the jury. "The evidence has been heard," he said, his voice measured, steady, "and now the jury will deliver its verdict." The foreman, a middle-aged man in a stiff suit, stood up, holding the paper that held Marcus's fate. He unfolded it slowly, cleared his throat, and spoke. "Guilty." The air was ripped from Marcus's lungs. He blinked, staring straight ahead, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. He had proof. He had witnesses. He had the truth, and none of it mattered. Karen stepped forward instantly. "Your Honor, with all due respect—" The judge was already speaking over her. "The defendant will stand for sentencing." Marcus barely moved. It felt like his body had been disconnected from his brain, like he had been thrown into someone else's nightmare. The judge barely even looked at him. "Dr. Marcus Hale, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison." The gavel came down. The sound echoed through Marcus's skull. 10 years. His ears were ringing. His heart was pounding. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. And then, finally, a single whisper of disbelief. "No!" Karen slammed her hands on the table. "We will be filing an appeal immediately." The judge was already gathering his papers, done with the case, done with Marcus, done with justice. Marcus turned, searching the room, catching glimpses of faces, some shocked, some indifferent, some avoiding his gaze entirely. Then he saw Lauren. His wife stood in the back, her hands clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide and wet. He had promised her that the truth would set him free. But the truth had never been enough. 2 guards moved toward him. The cold steel of the handcuffs wrapped around his wrists again, clicking shut like a final nail in a coffin. And as they led him away, past the cameras, past the reporters, past the people who would move on with their lives after today, Marcus realized something. This fight wasn't over, not even close. The courtroom was already in chaos. Murmurs rippled through the rows of spectators. Lauren was gripping the edge of her seat like she was trying to physically hold herself together. Marcus could barely process what had just happened. 10 years. 10 years of his life, stolen with a single swing of the gavel. And then the doors slammed open. The sharp bang echoed through the room, cutting through the noise like of a gunshot. Heads turned, conversation stopped. Even the bailiff, who had been gripping Marcus's arm to drag him away, hesitated. A man burst into the courtroom out of breath, eyes wild. His suit was slightly disheveled, his tie loose like he had run here. He was familiar. Marcus frowned, his brain sluggish from shock. He knew that face. He had seen it before, but not like this, not panicked, not desperate. Then the man's voice boomed through the room. "Judge!" Every set of eyes turned to the bench. The judge, who had already begun shuffling papers to move on to his next case, froze. His expression flickered. Annoyance, confusion, and then something else. Something Marcus couldn't quite place. "Sir, this is a court of law," the bailiff started, stepping toward the man. But the man didn't care. He wasn't here for protocol. His chest rose and fell as he sucked in a breath, pointing a shaking finger directly at Marcus. "That man saved my son's life." The words slammed into the room like a tidal wave. Silence. Absolute silence. For a beat, nobody moved. Then the judge visibly tensed. His face drained of color, his hands, which had been neatly stacking papers, stilled. "Excuse me?" His voice came out flat, but Marcus could hear it. Something uneasy just beneath the surface. The man took a few more steps forward, brushing past the bailiff, as if he wasn't even there. "That's Dr. Marcus Hale," the man said, voice raw. "He was the surgeon on duty at Chicago General 3 nights ago. He performed emergency heart surgery on my son, and he saved him." More murmurs, more shifting. Even the jury, who had just convicted Marcus, was now whispering among themselves. Marcus, still in shock, stared at the man. And then it hit him. The father of the little boy he had operated on. the one whose hands had been shaking as he signed the consent forms, the one who had barely been able to look at his son as they wheeled him into surgery, the one who had stood in the recovery room crying into his wife's shoulder when Marcus told them their son was going to be okay. That father. And right now, that same man was looking at the judge with fury in his eyes. "Tell me this is a mistake," the father demanded. His voice shook, but it wasn't weak. It was filled with rage. "Tell me you didn't just send an innocent man to prison." The judge didn't answer, because he couldn't, because Marcus saw it. He saw it in the way the judge's hands curled into fists, the way his jaw locked, the way his eyes flickered just briefly to the nameplate sitting on his bench. Judge Henry Johnson. Marcus had seen that name before, 3 nights ago, when he had checked the emergency contact form for the little boy he was about to operate on. Father's name, Henry Johnson. Marcus sucked in a sharp breath. No, it couldn't be. But as he stared at the judge, the man who had just coldly sentenced him to a decade behind bars, he watched the truth unfold in real time. The slight tremor in the judge's fingers, the way his eyes flickered toward the court reporter, like he was calculating. He wasn't just nervous, he was panicked, because this wasn't just some random outburst. This was his secret unraveling in front of everyone. And now the whole courtroom knew it. He had just sentenced the very man who saved his son's life, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. The weight in the room was suffocating. For the first time since this trial began, Judge Henry Johnson looked shaken. Not irritated, not dismissive. Shaken. His cold, unreadable expression had cracked, and through it, Marcus saw something that hadn't been there before. Fear. Not fear of Marcus. Fear of the truth. Judge Johnson's gaze locked onto him, his lips slightly parted, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Is this true? The question came out low, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't asking Marcus, as if he was begging him not to confirm it. Marcus didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, not because he was afraid, but because there was nothing left to say. They both knew the truth. Every single person in that courtroom knew it. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on the space between them like a slow-building storm. Marcus just stared at the man who had so casually sentenced him minutes ago. He didn't need to explain himself, didn't need to beg, didn't need to remind this judge that he was a surgeon, that he had spent the night in an OR fighting to keep a child alive while these accusations were being built against him. Judge Johnson already knew, because it was his son Marcus had saved. And now that undeniable fact was sitting between them like a ticking time bomb. The judge inhaled sharply. His fingers twitched, then curled over the edge of his desk. He was processing, running through every possible move, every possible way to fix this without crumbling under the weight of his own judgment. But there was no way out. Not this time. Slowly, too slowly, he lifted both hands and dragged them over his face, his fingers pressing into his temples. Then, finally, he did something Marcus hadn't seen him do once during this entire case. He showed emotion. It was subtle at first, a tightness in his jaw, a flicker of realization in his eyes. Then his shoulders slumped, his hands falling to the desk, fingers interlocked like he was holding himself together. The courtroom was dead silent. The reporters in the back had their cameras glued to him. The jury, who had just convicted Marcus, was frozen. Even the bailiff, still gripping Marcus's arm, had paused, his grip loosening. This was no longer just a trial. This was a reckoning. And Judge Henry Johnson was at the center of it. His breathing was uneven now, his once commanding presence diminished to nothing. He closed his eyes. Then he did something no one expected. He covered his face with both hands. A man who had spent years holding power over others. A man who had built his career on the finality of his rulings. Now he was sitting there, crumbling under the weight of his own decision. Because in all his years on the bench, in all his years handing down sentences like they were nothing more than signatures on a form, He had never sentenced the man who saved his own child's life, and there was no ruling in the world that could undo that now. The air in the courtroom was electric, tense, unstable. Everything had shifted. Just moments ago, the system had spoken. The gavel had come down, the verdict had been read, and Marcus had been branded guilty. But now, the judge sat frozen at his bench, hands over his face, like he was trying to physically block out reality. And the prosecutor, the same man who had built this case, brick by brick, who had stood there with confidence as he painted Marcus as a criminal, was suddenly stammering. The man visibly stiffened. His hands, once perfectly steady, now trembled just slightly as he shuffled the papers in front of him. His throat bobbed. He cleared it, eyes darting around the room like he was searching for an exit. We may have made a mistake. A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. A mistake? A mistake? The gallery erupted. The quiet murmurs exploded into full-blown chatter. The reporters at the back were scrambling, fingers flying over keyboards, cameras flashing wildly. Jurors shifted in their seats, some turning to one another with wide eyes, others staring straight ahead, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Lauren shot to her feet, eyes blazing. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice cutting through the noise. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. His heart pounded, but outwardly he was stone, because he knew how the system worked. It didn't admit fault, not like this. And yet, the prosecutor, the man who had been so sure, so smug, so relentless in tearing him down, was cracking right in front of him. Judge Johnson finally lifted his head. His face was pale, his hands still clenched together like he was holding on for dear life. He turned his gaze toward the prosecutor. "Explain," he said, his voice quieter than before. The prosecutor swallowed, hard. He adjusted his tie, his usual confident smirk nowhere to be found. He hesitated again, his mind spinning, desperate to find a way to regain control. "The witness—" He started, glancing at the folder on his desk. "We may need to reevaluate her statement." More murmurs. One of the jurors, an older woman who had looked utterly convinced of Marcus's guilt just minutes ago, narrowed her eyes. "You didn't verify her statement before bringing this case to trial?" she asked, arms crossing. The prosecutor's lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time in this entire circus of a trial, he looked exposed, because the truth was standing in front of him, undeniable. This wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. And now, with the world watching, it was falling apart. The courtroom had barely begun to settle before the media pounced. Reporters were already on their phones, their fingers flying across screens, typing headlines that would hit the internet within seconds. Camera crews rushed to position themselves, lenses zooming in on the judge, the prosecutor, the man they had just convicted, only to realize they had just tried to bury their own hero. The whispers in the courtroom had become a storm outside, and by the time Marcus was escorted back into holding, the story had already exploded. Breaking news: judge sentences the surgeon who saved his son. Corruption or coincidence? Chicago, judge rules against his family's savior. Marcus Hale. From hero to wrongfully convicted? The media didn't just report it. They sank their teeth into it. Talk shows ran the footage of the father bursting into the courtroom, shouting that Marcus had saved his child's life. News anchors repeated the judge's reaction, how his hands covered his face, how he suddenly looked like a man who had just realized he had signed his own career's death warrant. Pundits debated it on live TV. "There's no way this judge didn't know," one legal analyst said, shaking her head. "How does a man forget the name of the person who performed life-saving surgery on his own child?" "If this isn't corruption, then it's the worst case of judicial incompetence we've seen in years," another guest fired back. "And outside the courthouse?" People were furious. Crowds began gathering. Protesters held signs with Marcus's face printed in bold letters, the words "Free Dr. Hale" stamped underneath. Social media? On fire. #Justice Forder Hale was trending within an hour. The internet dug into Judge Johnson's record, and what they found didn't look good. Old cases resurfaced, cases where black defendants were handed maximum sentences while white ones walked free on lesser charges. His history of rulings was suddenly national news. Every skeleton in his closet was being dragged into the daylight, one headline at a time. And inside his office, away from the cameras, Judge Johnson knew it was over. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a full-blown scandal, and the world wasn't letting this one go. Judge Henry Johnson stood at the podium, his grip tightening on the edges like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. The entire country was watching and waiting. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly under the heat of the lights. The weight of the microphone in front of him felt heavier than it should have. He began, his voice cracking slightly. He swallowed and started again, slower this time. I did not know. Silence. A single heartbeat of silence. And then, the eruption. The press pounced like a pack of wolves. Judge Johnson, are you saying you had no idea Dr. Hale was the man who performed surgery on your son? One reporter fired. If you knew, would you still have sentenced him? Another pushed. Are you denying any personal bias in this case? The questions came rapid fire, relentless. Johnson lifted a hand, an attempt to regain control. This court operates under facts and the law. Personal details do not... Personal details? A reporter from the Tribune scoffed. Sir, this isn't some minor detail. This is the man who saved your son's life. Johnson's mouth pressed into a thin line. I was not aware at the time. Then how do you explain the conviction? More cameras flashed. More voices piled on. Johnson's face tightened. Because he knew they weren't buying it, and neither was the public. The backlash. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had tripled in size. Free Dr. Hale. The chant shook the air, a relentless demand for justice. Signs waved, fists were raised, and the outrage was no longer just local. It had gone national. Talk shows dissected every word he had said. Social media wasn't letting go. So, let me get this straight. This judge just forgot the name of the man who saved his kid's life? If the system can do this to a surgeon with a spotless record, imagine what happens to regular people every single day. This isn't just about Marcus Hale. This is about how easy it is to destroy an innocent man's life when the system doesn't care. The pressure was building. Protests spread to other cities. Petitions demanding the case be overturned hit hundreds of thousands of signatures overnight. And Judge Johnson? He was running out of places to hide. Because this time, the system had messed with the wrong man. And the people weren't letting it slide. Karen Lee had argued in a lot of courtrooms. She had defended men who were guilty, men who were innocent, and men who had made one bad decision and were paying for it more than they should have. But this was different. Because this wasn't just about Marcus Hale anymore. This was about what happens when the system gets caught. The courtroom was packed, every row filled, every seat taken, and the press lined the back wall, cameras aimed at the front, like snipers waiting to capture history in real time. Outside, the protests had swelled tenfold. The voices chanting, "Free Dr. Hale!" echoed so loudly through the marble hallways that it felt like the courthouse itself was shaking under the weight of public outrage. Karen straightened her blazer, took one last glance at Marcus, and stepped forward. She owned the room the moment she spoke. "Your Honors," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "the conviction of Dr. Marcus Hale is not only legally unsound, it is an embarrassment to this court and everything it claims to stand for." The prosecutor stiffened in his seat, his jaw clenching, but Karen didn't look at him. She wasn't here to argue with him. She was here to speak directly to the only people in the room who had the power to undo this disaster. She lifted a thick case file, one that should have been enough to clear Marcus in the first trial. "In front of me is documented, time-stamped proof that my client was in an operating room at the exact time of the crime he was accused of committing." She set the file down on the table with just enough force to make the microphones pick up the sound. That should have been enough. A murmur rippled through the audience. The judges remained impassive, but one of them, Judge Richardson, An older man with a reputation for being fair but ruthless leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Then why wasn't it?" he asked. Karen's lips twitched. "Because that?" That was the right question. "Because," she said, locking eyes with him, "Judge Henry Johnson ignored it. He dismissed a time-stamped alibi as irrelevant and allowed a witness whose testimony changed overnight to serve as the prosecution's key evidence." She turned, flipping open another page of her file. "That witness, Your Honors, was approached by the prosecution before the trial even started, and suddenly her testimony became more certain, more detailed, and more aligned with the state's case." More murmurs. Karen took a measured breath, then dropped the hammer. "But the most damning fact of all?" She turned fully toward the panel now, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. "Judge Henry Johnson personally benefited from Dr. Hale's work." Silence. "You're saying," Judge Richardson said carefully, "that the presiding judge had a personal connection to the defendant?" "Yes." Karen let that sit for a moment before continuing. "The very man who sentenced my client to 10 years in prison had, just days before this trial, been in a hospital praying over his son's life." She turned a sharp gaze toward the prosecutor, watching as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "And the man he was praying for?" she asked. She didn't give him time to answer. "Dr. Marcus Hale, the man whose hands saved his child." That was it. That was the moment the courtroom shifted. One of the other judges exhaled loudly. Another glanced at the prosecutor like he was trying to gauge just how deep this corruption ran. But Karen wasn't finished. Judge Johnson failed to disclose this information, refused to recuse himself, and ruled against the very man who saved his family. He had a personal stake in this case, and still sat on the bench as if he was impartial. That alone is grounds for immediate reversal. The prosecutor stood abruptly. "Your Honors, this is—" Karen turned sharply. "This is what?" she asked, her voice dangerously smooth. "A clear violation of legal ethics? A miscarriage of justice? A case where an innocent man was sent to prison because the system prioritized conviction over truth? Because that's exactly what this is." The prosecutor clenched his jaw. The jury still found him guilty. Karen's eyes narrowed. A jury that was misled. A jury that was denied key evidence. A jury that was manipulated by a judge who had no business presiding over this case. She turned back to the panel. The prosecution's case is falling apart. The media is already uncovering more and more of Judge Johnson's history, his conviction rates, his biased rulings. How many more cases need to be re-examined before this court acknowledges that Marcus Hale was nothing more than another victim of a broken system? The weight in the room was unbearable. Then, finally, Judge Richardson let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. "Miss Lee," he said slowly, tapping his fingers against the bench, "this court will review your motion and issue a ruling soon." Karen gave a single, respectful nod. But Marcus? Marcus, for the first time since this nightmare began, felt something he hadn't dared to feel in weeks. Hope. The moment it was announced that Hale v. the state was officially moving to the Supreme Court, everything changed. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a war. It was a war against a system that had chewed up and spit out innocent men for generations. A war against judges who thought they were untouchable. A war against the quiet, unspoken corruption that had been running in the background for far too long. And at the center of it all, Judge Henry Johnson. The man who had once ruled from his bench without hesitation, who had passed down sentences like he was handing out parking tickets, now sat in his office, staring at the headlines that screamed his name. Judge Johnson under investigation for wrongful conviction, Supreme Court to review controversial case, systemic bias under scrutiny. How many other lives has this judge destroyed? His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't supposed to happen. The system had always protected men like him. But this time, the system had turned on him. The governor's office had already started making calls. The Judicial Ethics Board was breathing down his neck. There were whispers of an early retirement. Polite words for resign before we drag you out, And the Supreme Court? They weren't just looking at Marcus Hale's case. They were looking at all of his cases, every ruling, every conviction, every time he had chosen to deny bail, dismiss evidence, overrule objections. They were going through his record like forensic analysts at a crime scene. Johnson exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. His career, his legacy, was crumbling. And the worst part? He had done it to himself, because if he had just paid attention, if he had just looked at the name on the hospital file before sentencing Marcus Hale to 10 years behind bars, he would have realized. But now it was too late. Now the highest court in the country was reviewing his mistakes, and this time he wouldn't be the one slamming the gavel. This time he was the one on trial. The courtroom was silent, holding its breath as the lead justice spoke. This court finds the original conviction was compromised. Key evidence was ignored, the judge had a conflict of interest, and prosecutorial misconduct influenced the verdict. Marcus's heart pounded. This court rules that Dr. Marcus Hale's conviction be vacated in full. The words hit like a thunderclap. Karen squeezed his arm. "Marcus," she whispered, voice shaking, "you're free." For a moment he just sat there, the weight of everything pressing down. Then the bailiff, the same one who had cuffed him, stepped forward and took the cuffs off. The courtroom erupted. Cheers, applause, reporters rushing to break the story. Marcus stood slowly, as if the moment might disappear if he moved too fast. His eyes found Lauren in the crowd, her face streaked with tears, but her expression strong. He stepped toward her, and when she fell into his arms, holding him like she would never let go again, he finally let himself breathe. The same system that protected Judge Henry Johnson for years turned on him overnight. Effective immediately, Judge Henry Johnson is removed from the bench. No appeal, no second chances. His career was over. And Marcus, he was already walking free. Breathing again. The courthouse doors swung open, and Marcus stepped outside. The air felt sharper, the world brighter. He was a free man. The crowd erupted. "Marcus is free!" Lauren ran to him, her arms wrapping around his waist. For the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself breathe. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The meeting wasn't planned. Marcus had no interest in seeing the man who nearly destroyed his life. No need for an apology wrapped in guilt. But when the request came, Judge Henry Johnson wanted to speak with him. Something in Marcus told him to go, not for closure, not for forgiveness, but because he wanted to see the man stripped of his power. The two men stood in a quiet, empty hallway, away from cameras, away from the noise. Johnson looked smaller now, his once commanding posture replaced by slumped shoulders, his face lined with exhaustion. For the first time, he wasn't looking down at Marcus from behind a judge's bench. He was looking up, face to face, man to man. "I was wrong," Johnson finally said, his voice rough. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't blink, just watched him. Johnson exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I didn't see it then, but I see it now." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "And what is it you see?" The former judge hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "I see how easy it was for me to throw your life away." The words hung there, heavy and sharp. Marcus didn't respond, because what was there to say? Johnson had already seen the consequences of his actions play out in real time. His career? Gone. His reputation? Shattered. There was no taking it back. All Marcus did was nod once, a simple, calm acknowledgement. Then he turned, leaving Johnson standing there, alone, drowning in the weight of his own regrets. The automatic doors slid open, and the familiar scent of antiseptic and fresh linen filled Marcus's lungs. The steady beeping of monitors, the quiet hum of voices, the rhythmic shuffle of nurses moving through the halls. It was all the same. But he wasn't. Marcus Hale had walked into this hospital 1,000 times before, but today was different. Because today, he was walking in as a free man. The past few months had been a war, but he had won. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been swallowed by the system and never made it out. A few nurses spotted him first. Their eyes widened, then smiles. Genuine. Relieved. A ripple of movement spread through the hallway as more staff turned, whispers building, heads nodding in acknowledgement. Dr. Hale was back. A younger doctor, someone he barely recognized, stepped forward, extending a hand. "Welcome back, sir." Marcus shook it, his grip firm. Then, without another word, he kept walking. Past the recovery rooms, past the surgical ward, past the place where his life had nearly been taken from him. He stopped at his office, letting his fingers graze the nameplate on the door. Dr. Marcus Hale, Chief of Surgery. His title was still there. His legacy had survived. He exhaled slowly, the weight of everything finally lifting. Because after everything, the false charges, the courtroom battles, the prison walls closing in, the fight to prove what should have never needed proving, he had made it. And now he would keep saving lives, because truth always wins, even when the world tries to bury it.